So what are you anxious about today? Realize that's not a fair question, because you may have to think about it for a second. There may be many of you who go, oh, I know what I'm anxious about. I'm sitting next to it. But anxiety is part of the human experience. All of us experience it. You don't get through this life. We live in a dangerous world, and anxiety goes hand in hand with our journey through this life. So what are you really anxious about? Because we all have it. And so today I want to make a suggestion that possibly can help you with that anxiety. I want to share a solution that possibly can see you through your struggle with your anxiety. And it's written like this. There. Helpful? No, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, nobody told me there'd be math. I came here because there wasn't going to be math. Math stresses me out. That actually makes me more anxious, not less anxious. And I understand that. But what this represents is a formula for dealing with regret. Regret really is just forensic anxiety. Anxiety about the things that have gone wrong in the past, disappointments and frustrations, and those things that we struggle with that have already passed. Regret is simply forensic anxiety. And this is a formula for overcoming regret. 3 weeks ago, we began our new year. We began 2020, and I extended an invitation to you. I said, maybe you'd be willing to join me in making 2020 a year that we lived beyond regret. That if it were possible, we would live a year so that at the end of the year, we would look back and we would not have to apologize for anything. That we would not be sorry about the choices that we made. The challenge of that is significant, but I believe it is possible for us to live beyond regret. Regret is a part of the human condition. It's like anxiety and worry and fear. It is part of the human experience. But because it is unavoidable, doesn't mean it's not unredeemable. We can redeem regret. We will encounter it, but we don't have to be overwhelmed by it, just like anxiety. And 3 weeks ago, I suggested that we inoculate ourselves against the infection of regret by practicing a formula that the Apostle Paul gives to us in a letter that he wrote to the church in Philippi. In the 4th chapter of the letter to the Philippians, the Apostle Paul gives us a liturgical pharmaceutical prescription. And it begins with the instruction to rejoice. Rejoice always, he says. And again I say, rejoice. That's the first part of this equation. For joy is actually kairo, which is the Greek word for joy, and hope. The hopeful joy, the joyful hopefulness is the first element that sees us through the struggle with regret. The second element, he says, let your gentleness, and that's represented by grace, by the symbol theos for God, the theta for God. And so let your grace or let your gentleness be seen. And gentleness is really a byproduct of love and faith. It is the evidence of our faith. It is the evidence of grace. These things added together are multiplied by prayer over anxiety. Because what does Paul say next? The next part of the formula for living above regret is that we should not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, through prayer and petition, let your requests be made known to God. This is a formula for actually coming to terms with our anxiety. Because regret is simply forensic anxiety. And even though regret and anxiety are inevitable and unavoidable, they are not unredeemable. And today I want to process the idea that anxiety is a good thing because it pushes us into a place of intimacy with God. And I want to talk about the power of an anxious prayer. But before we do that, give me a moment to practice that. Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your word spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to calm our hearts. May we get a taste of some infinite peace. Pray that for myself, for my family, and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name, amen. I want to perform a social experiment this morning, and I need you to watch a video. And I need you to promise me that you will not turn away from this video. The video is only 30 seconds long. But I don't want you to turn away, and I don't want you to close your eyes. I want you to watch all 30 seconds of it. And I'm going to be watching you. So roll the video, watch this. We had one crying baby, the first appropriate response. How did that make you feel? How did that make you feel? I realize there's probably a percentage of you who are adrenaline junkies and extreme athletes, and you're watching that video going, dude, that was so awesome. I gotta go do that. Show me a 40-story building I can do dips off of. Show me something that I can hang from one hand with. I gotta go do that. Man, I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was mesmerizing, so cool. I'm glad you're here. If you think that, I'm really glad you're here because you need help. You need professional help, and we're here for you. But the rest of us, for the clear majority of us, we watch that video and it's difficult to watch. It kind of makes us feel uneasy when a guy is hanging 20 stories above the ground and he pulls his phone out of his pocket or he's skateboarding on the ledge of a building. All we imagine is, oops. All we imagine is Hans Gruber falling from the Nakatomi building at the end of Die Hard. We just picture this image of a terrifying fall to their death. You see, every living creature, everything that is alive has built into it the evolution of humanity, the evolution of life on Earth has had to survive threats and danger. And so every living thing has mechanisms by which they protect themselves. And vertebrate animals, of which we are the highest form, all vertebrate animals have a very sophisticated threat detection mechanism. Human beings have a particularly sophisticated threat detection process. It begins with the sensory input that our bodies take in, things we hear, things we feel, things we smell, things we see, things we touch, things we feel, and we are constantly processing our environment. All of that is routed through this what's called the RAS, the reticular activating system, which is at the cortex of our brains. It's a very delicate bundle of the accumulation of the nervous system of our body, and it functions kind of like our neurobiological Google. And basically what it does is it filters through all of the senses that are feeding into our brain, and it kind of categorizes them. Over the course of your life, it says familiar, unfamiliar, safe, unsafe, hot, cold, go that way, run away, friend, foe. All of those sensitivities are kind of processed through the RAS. And they're filtered through into the limbic center of our brains, into our hippocampus and our hypothalamus, and into our amygdala, in the middle of our brain. And this is sort of the emotional fear center of our brain. And it takes the chemical electronic signals that are traveling at the speed of light from the RAS, and it filters through them, and then it sends out appropriate chemical responses, endorphins or oxytocins or dopamine or serotonin. It sends out signals to the frontal cortex of our brain that tells our body to close our eyes or turn our head, or tells our mouth to say, "Oh my God." And all of this happens at the speed of light. Every moment we're constantly processing these threats. It's part of who we are. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's how we survive in a dangerous world. We're constantly being able to evaluate changes in people's facial expressions and whether people are hostile or friendly, whether the environment is warm or cold. All of these things are constantly processed in this miraculous neurobiological part of our brain. And that's a good thing, because it allows us to make assessments in real time about our life. But it's also a problem, because we are so sophisticated. Evolutionary biologists theorize that we have developed such an advanced threat assessment system that we not only can evaluate the threats that are around us in our physical environment, we can predict threats to come. We have the ability through the limbic system of our brain to actually predict how we will feel if certain things happen. We have the ability to project out. It's why we react with that physical sensation when you watch that video. I don't know if you realize it, but that was a video. You weren't there. You weren't standing on the edge of a building. You weren't hanging to a rod 20 stories above the ground. You were just watching it happen, but our brains are so sophisticated that we feel the emotion and the fear and the anxiety of that moment as if we were there. We have sort of an atemporal anxiety, an anxiety that transcends time. We can project into the future. We even can review and reflect on and remember the anxiety of our past. This is what forensic anxiety is. It's what regret is. It is that revisiting of the, oh, why did I do that? Oh, why did this happen? How could I have been so stupid? And we have this collected ability to be anxious about things that don't even exist. There's no other animal like us. There's no other living creature, vertebrate or invertebrate, that can do what we do. You don't see a bunch of antelope on the Serengeti standing around worrying about what will happen when the lions wake up. They don't worry about the lion until the lion is there. Then they're very hypersensitive to its presence. You don't see therapy groups of zebras and springboks and impalas who are getting together going, oh man, the other day when that crocodile came out of the water, it was so terrifying. I can't believe it. I was so traumatized. I can't even process my future. It doesn't happen in anybody but us. And because of that heightened sense of creating imaginary and forensic anxiety, we struggle with it all the time. It doesn't even have to be real. This is exactly what Jesus was talking about 2,000 years before anybody understood anything about neuroscience or the way that our amygdala or our hippocampus worked. Before anybody understood that, he understood our ability to create anxiety atemporally, beyond time. In Matthew chapter 6, the 6th chapter of Matthew, Jesus teaches about anxiety and worry. It's probably the most profound teaching that is anywhere in the Bible on anxiety. And in the 6th chapter of Matthew, Jesus says, let me ask you this. Who of you will live an extra hour because you worried more? How can you add time to your life, much less quality to your life, if it is filled with anxiety and worry and fear? And he says, don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. Every day, right now, there's plenty to be anxious about. You don't need to embellish or exaggerate that anxiety. The word for worry and anxiety that he uses there is the word merimnate. It's the same word that the Apostle Paul uses in Philippians chapter 4 when he's talking about the force multiplier of prayer. When he says, don't be anxious for anything, he uses the same word Jesus uses, merimnate. Merimnate is an ancient word. It's a word that goes back to ancient Persian language. It's a loan word from Eastern ancient history. And it was a word that was developed to express the idea of care, of compassion. But the Greeks understood that the care can be a good thing, but too much care can be a bad thing. It can be a bad thing because what it does is we can be overwhelmed by our concerns. We can be overwhelmed with our cares. Do you know what that is? To be overwhelmed. It's a good thing to care. It's a bad thing to be overwhelmed by your care and your compassion and your concern. And merimnate has that idea. When Paul is saying, don't be anxious about anything, he's not saying that you're going to avoid anxiety. It is unavoidable. But don't be overwhelmed by it. Don't let anxiety overwhelm you. And then, like a good counselor, like he was a trained therapist, the Apostle Paul kind of breaks down the steps for dealing with our anxiety. And the description that we have of it is that we should pray. But the way it's written out there in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 is he gives us three components of prayer. He says, but in every situation, pray or ask God. The word is prosuke or proskao. And prosuke is a word that basically means to ask a person of authority. It originally meant to kiss someone's ring. It literally meant to kiss something, to kiss someone, like we would say kissing other body parts in order to get what you want. You're kissing up to someone. That's the idea that this person has the ability to provide us with something that we need or deny us something that we need. So the respect that you show that person is how you approach them. And it's the first insight into how the power of an anxious prayer. Remember who you're talking to. Remember who it is you're talking to. That we are invited, you and I are invited. The invitation is without condition. Cast your cares on me because I care for you. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. If you come to me, I will receive you. You are welcome to come to me, but don't forget who you're talking to. Now, my prayer practice, one of the things that I try to do is I try to remember the character of God. I try to remember the awesomeness of God, the love of God, the grace of God. And when I'm having a hard time articulating that, I cheat a little bit by going and reading the book of Psalms. Because the book of Psalms is an insight into, it's kind of like eavesdropping on a counseling session between a human and God. And you hear the complaints and you hear God's response, and it reminds us of the promise of the intimacy of God and the authority of God and the power of God. Another way that I try to engage when I'm anxious in that anxious prayer is through music. Through the things that Casey was doing today, by stirring my soul, by reminding me of the beauty and the majesty of God. At a neurobiological level, I like to imagine that prayer is entering into sort of our spiritual amygdala. Most neuroscientists believe that the amygdala is a part of our brain that houses sort of the emotional epicenter of our personality. And I like to think of the amygdala as a room, and the only way you can access that room is through stress. You have to take risk to get in that room, but when you're in that room, when you find that room, it's full of light and beauty and art and music. And it has windows, and there's sunsets and seascapes, and it's a beautiful place. And if you can find your way through your stress into that place, into the presence of that beauty and that wonder and that awe, that's kind of what it means to pray an anxious prayer. The second word that he uses is the word daise. And daise is translated there, petition. With prayer and petition, make your requests known to God. And petition is kind of a sanitized version of daise. Daise, literally, the way I like to translate it is dump the truck. Just kind of let God know what you're feeling. Just let it all hang out. Use your coarsest language. Use your most honest confessions. Yell at God. Scream at God. Shake your fist at God. There's a therapeutic value in the catharsis of saying, I'm disappointed in you. Why did you let this happen? I'm angry at you. I'm frustrated. Prayer invites that in. Paul says, first of all, come and remember who you're talking to, and then dump the truck. Remember, just be honest, cathartic about what you're feeling. And then he closes it by saying, make your requests known to God. It literally says, identify your desires and make God know them. It's kind of like, okay, God, this is what I'm worried about. This is what I'm anxious about. This is what I want. This is what I hate. This is what I love. And you create a list. You create a checklist. These are the things that I'm struggling with. These are the things that I'm thankful for. These are the things that I wish I had. These are the things that I wish I didn't have. It's good counseling strategy. There's a great counseling strategy. If you've ever been trained as a counselor, you understand that one of the first responsibilities of a counselor is to help the client understand exactly what it is they're dealing with. What are you afraid of? What are you worried about? Identify it, define it, detail it. Because as you give it an identity, as you begin to express the sort of the identity of your fears and your worries and your anxieties, you begin to cut them down to size. Because when those fears and anxieties and worries remain in our minds unidentified, they're monsters. They're infinitely big and never ending. But a good counselor can help a person begin to break down those things into kind of manageable pieces. One of the ways that I do it, and this is a real practical thing, and I'm not sure this is prayer, but it has a prayer effect on me, is when I'm stressed out and I have phone calls I have to make and letters I have to write and emails I have to return and I have conversations I have to have and meetings I have to sit through and things I have to prepare for. And I'm kind of overwhelmed with sort of all of the loose ends that are out there. I make to-do lists. That's kind of what this means. Make your to-do list. And so I'll make a to-do list, and as I begin to write things out, it starts to get manageable. I start to see that, oh, okay, it's not an infinite number of things. It's a lot to do, but I can get a handle on it. And I have this habit when I make a to-do list. You know what the first thing I put on the to-do list is? Make a to-do list. So that when I'm done, I just check it off. I said, I'm underway. Here we go. I'm getting everything done. I checked off the first box. But that's what it is with God. It's like, here it is. Here's the list of my heart, of my desires, of my struggles, of my wounds, of my fears, of my anxieties. I'm just going to lay these things out to you. And this is provoked by anxiety. It's our fear, it's our worry, it's our anxiety that presses us into this spiritual amygdala, that presses us into this place of intimacy with God. Neuroscientists tell us that our brains are incredibly flexible. That they actually increase in their size, in their capacity, and they atrophy when parts of our brain are underused. And the limbic system, depending on how we use it, the hippocampus and the amygdala can actually grow and shrink, depending on the neural pathways that we create, the way that we visit, whether it's volitionally or involuntarily, whether we're dealing with anxiety that we understand or anxiety that overwhelms us. It creates different neural pathways in our brain. It's why we get that feeling when we fall in love. And it heightens that neural pathway, and we want more of that. It's the same, neuroscientists believe that's why it's good to travel, to see things you've never seen before, to eat food you've never tasted before, to meet people you've never met before. These are good things because they actually activate latent neural pathways that help us to be healthier emotionally. It's why those knuckleheads stand on the edges of buildings and hang their toes over the edge, because the feeling that they get is rehearsing that neural pathway. That's why they become base jumpers and extreme athletes and rock stars. And we do all those crazy things that we do because there's a risk, and as we take that risk and we manage that risk, the fear doesn't get less, our courage gets greater. You see, the secret of prayer is that it doesn't make anxiety go away. It just gives us the courage to face it. It just says, you can do this. We reprogram our brains so that we can do these amazing things. It's called El Capitan. It is a rock formation in the northwest corner of the Yosemite National Park. It is a magnificent, awe-inspiring sight. The southeast face of El Capitan is literally almost 3/4 of a mile tall, 3,000 feet of sheer granite. From the time it was first discovered, I don't know that it was technically discovered, but the first time Americans were made aware of this beautiful work of nature, people automatically lined up and said, I want to climb that thing. I want to climb right up that rock. But it's 3,000 feet of solid granite. It took until 1958 before anyone was able to actually climb from the base to the summit of the southeast face. In 1958, a 3-man team of American climbers took 47 days. But they were the first to climb up what was called the nose route of the southeast face of El Capitan. It wasn't until 1975 that an individual climbed with the assistance of ropes and climbing gear and pitons and carabiners and a climbing team that a single individual was able to climb the entire 3,000 feet in one day. In 2010, a young man from Sacramento visited Yosemite and said, someday I'm going to climb the face of that without ropes. I want to free climb that rock. His name was Alex Hunold, and Alex was a climber from the time that he was 4 or 5 years old. And he, for the next 7 years, dreamed about and kind of sketched out the idea of how he would approach free climbing. And what free climbing is climbing without any aid. It's just basically your hands and your feet on the rock climbing. What it would take to free climb El Capitan. And for the next 7 years, he thought about it, he dreamt about it. And then for a year, he studied it. And he went with teams of his friends and he marked out a route and he would climb it with ropes and with belays and he would mark out every handhold and he memorized every foot placement and every handhold. Because I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of gravity. But once you get about 200 feet off the ground and you have nothing holding you up other than your hands or feet on a vertical piece of rock and something goes wrong, that little tip of the finger that's in a crack dislodges, or your foothold that you thought was secure isn't, you die. You fall to your death. And so Alex spent the next year rehearsing and memorizing thousands of exact hand placements and foot placements. During that year, he met a filmmaker. His name was Jimmy Chin, and Jimmy Chin was quite an accomplished climber of his own. And when he found out what Alex was going to attempt, he said, we have to document this. This has to be recorded on film. And he got a group of other expert climbers, and they decided how they would record Alex's free solo climb of El Capitan. They called it a documentary called Free Solo. It won the Academy Award last year in 2018 for Best Documentary Feature. But it was on June the 3rd, 2017 at 5:38 in the morning that Alex Honnold stood at the base of El Capitan with just his shoes, his shorts, his shirt, and a bag of chalk, and began his ascent. About 2,000 feet up the climb of El Capitan, the route that he had planned was the technically most challenging section. They called it the boulder problem. 2,000 feet off the ground, almost a half mile in the air, Alex Honnold was going to have to climb across a face of sheer granite. There were no cracks, there were no crevices. But his route forced him to move laterally across the boulder. The only place he could place his hands was a small eggplant-sized outcropping on the face of the boulder. He would have to, simply by pressing his feet against the rock and reaching out for this eggplant-sized bump in the stone, pull himself over. He would then have to do an impossible move. With his one leg, he would have to kick it up as high as his head to a small wedge of rock about 4 feet away. He would have to brace himself and then push himself over to a crevasse and a crack that would allow him to pull himself off of the boulder. This was such a technically difficult move that he practiced it hundreds of times with ropes, falling virtually every time. As he approached it on June the 3rd, his friend Jimmy Chin, the filmmaker, was standing behind his camera at ground level, and he turned around and walked away. He couldn't watch because he knew that it had to be absolutely perfect or he would die. This is what it looked like.
Just did the karate kick. He's got it.
Oh, yeah.
That's hard for me to watch. And I know he lived. I know how it turns out. He completed the climb in 3 hours and 58 minutes. At just around 9:30 in the morning, he popped up over the edge, and there were people who had hiked up the backside, and they're like, dude, how'd you get up here? They had no idea that he had just done something that was humanly impossible, climbing 3,000 feet up a vertical wall perfectly. What did you feel when you watched that video? What you feel when you watch that video is you feel those triggers of anxiety and concern and worry and fear. And those are good things. They're good things because they tell us that there's a need for us to find refuge. There's a need for us to find our way through that anxiety and that fear. It provokes us to pray. And this is a good thing because anxiety is unavoidable. But just like regret, it is not unredeemable. We can see our way through it. We can live beyond anxiety. And regret is simply forensic anxiety. It's just anxiety about the things that have happened. And the formula for dealing with regret is what Paul gives us in Philippians chapter 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. It is joy with Cairo over hope. It is a joyful hope. that is added to grace and gentleness. Let your gentleness be evident to all. It is a multiple of love and faith exhibited in our daily lives. And all of this is multiplied, the force of it is multiplied as prayer supersedes anxiety. This is the pathway through anxiety. This is the ability that we have to live beyond these things. Next week, we're going to talk about the secret sauce, the plus T. So we glossed over in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, with prayer and petition, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving. Make your requests known to God, and then you will experience infinite peace. Now, I know that you didn't come here to do math, but if you really want to understand how this equation balances out, it balances out like this. R for regret. As long as this is greater than this, you will see your way through it. So, I ask you again, what are you anxious about? And when was the last time that you really prayed?